A while back, I made a video about inspiration for fantasy writers that wasn't other fantasy. And really, the point I was trying to drive home in that video was the importance of nature writing. Our heroes spend so much time in the middle of nowhere, so it's really an important skill for a fantasy writer to have the ability to, put to words the majesty of the nature around them. Whenever I'm reading fantasy that doesn't really pay any attention to the overland travel or even just where they're at, I start to feel displaced. Part of the fantasy is a world that hasn't been taken over by industrialization yet, at least for me. And that's exactly what I talked about with our guest today. Scott J. Bradley is a museum consultant in Thunder Bay, and he's also a debut fantasy author who just a few months ago released his first book, The Cave of Past and Present. I was lucky enough to receive a review copy in the email, and I really enjoyed what I read. It really straddles that line between scientific writing and the whimsy of fantasy. There's apparently some interesting world building going on that kind of makes it a little bit of both, which I find very interesting because this is absolutely a wonderful blend of science fiction and fantasy, specifically in the way that Scott writes an observant scientific character. The world around them is vivid and full of detail. It's really a fascinating read. I highly recommend you check it out. The link is in the description. Before we begin, I want to remind you that the Literary Fantasy Magazine 2026 is in full swing. If you subscribe today, you will get the spring issue sent to your door with 3 more following. No matter when you subscribe in the process, you get whatever's available. So if you subscribe in autumn, you get spring, summer, and autumn, and then you'll get winter in December. All right, enough of my rambling. Let's get to the talk.
I do book publishing as part of my job. So I'm the executive director of a museum, and we have a publishing program. So we publish non-fiction books about Northwestern Ontario. And so part of my job is doing the marketing and getting the books to market. And we were originally a traditional publisher, doing just paper and doing very small kind of press stuff. We print 300-400. That was good enough. And in the last couple of years, we've really gone, okay, we need to start getting our books on Kindle. We really need to start getting our books out there on Ingram Spark. And we need to do some more marketing than just shooting around a media release and doing kind of the small things, because we wanted to start creating some mass market books. And so that really got me the experience and the right mindset, like, okay, we need to find out who is really the niche for our history books. And so when I turned this into my own projects, I really looked around the web and I used AI to help me. I was like, where are my people for this book? And so that's really where I stumbled across your website. And I'm like, I think they would like this. I think they would appreciate this.
Yeah, you came to the right place, and you pitched it really well. It was extremely professional. We're running a Kickstarter right now, so I get spam email daily, just from people pretending to be, like, not even celebrities, but like people associated with celebrities, where they seem like they're real creative people, but they're just kind of ripping their identity and going off their social credit. So yeah. Yours was among all of that spam that I was deleting that morning. And I was like, this looks like a real thing. This might be a real person.
Maybe I threw in a couple spelling errors that might have made it seem like a human. I'm a Dungeons and Dragons player since the age of 10, and I'm in my 40s now. I was a history major in university. I also have a master's in public history. And I've worked in the museum field for the last 23 years. And, doing fantasy writing and all those kinds of things have always been a passion of mine. And more recently, kind of a fire got lit under me. I just felt the need that I needed to finish kind of this multi-year project I've been working on. Cave of Past and Present, something I've been really kind of tinkering with for probably a decade. And I had multiple drafts, kind of started. And I was like, this isn't great. And I started it again. And I'm like, this isn't great. And finally, I was just like, no, I've got to finish this. I've got to do this. And I've got to do it so that I can present it to my kids. I can share with my family, because all these stories have been flowing around inside my head. And I really kind of was thinking about all these stories that I've got written inside my head, and I was like, how do I start them all? How do I tie all these stories together? And so Cave and Past and Present is really kind of the beginning. It's kind of the little bit of world building. And so it was just kind of, let's start with a small project. Let's figure out what I want to do, how I'm going to do my process. And so it's not perfect, but it's the start, and it'll get better.
What I really admired about the book right off the bat is I find fantasy very interesting when it's written from the perspective of an expert and the author shares that expertise. Moira is a scientist. I'm not entirely sure what kind she is. Is she an archaeologist in the world?
She's kind of a she's yeah, she's kind of a geologist. But being a scientist like that, you kind of have to be an omni-scientist. So if you're a geologist, oh well, you're probably finding you're finding fossils, you're finding petrified things. Well, now you got to kind of know what those are, and so she's a bit of an omni-scientist. So that kind of comes out where she's obviously in the book you've probably read, she's identifying everything she sees, sometimes in detail and repetitiveness.
Yeah, and that is what I really enjoyed about her perspective is so I have a small background in the sciences. I did a minor in psychology during undergrad, and that was in addition to my literary training. What I find, like when I'm reading Darwin or when I'm reading those writings, the way that those authors focus, the things that they focus on in their environment, the way that they describe the world around them, it's very different from the traditional artistic literary lens, which in of itself creates this very unique tone that I am just addicted to when it comes to this stuff. Tell me about how your experience working with museums, working in the field of archaeology, how that has informed your writing.
So, ooh, I spend a lot of time worrying about facts, and I start worrying about point of view and tone and thinking about the big picture ideas. So like when we're writing an exhibit, we're thinking about what the big idea is. So what do we want the visitor to come away with? What do we want them to understand? And then, we kind of insert all these educational goals within that. And so some of this book is written as, okay, what do I want all my readers to understand about my world? And then kind of put that through Moira's lens and a little bit of Macaron's lens, and understand a little bit of their feelings, their motivations, but also the things they don't understand. And so, you can see that sometimes the characters are going to be a little bit confused about things, or they're even going to state things that are probably wrong, or the book's going to prove wrong later. And so, that coming from that kind of museum background and thinking about how we as public historians convey things kind of is informing some of how I'm approaching each chapter about what we want to convey through that, rather than kind of thinking about it from a very much like what advances the story. So it's a little different take.
Yeah. The unreliable narrator is a classic device and used in that way where they're making scientific assumptions or observations that are somehow misguided or incorrect. It's really clever. There's also a bit of like found media almost. That's the best word I have for it. Trying to come up with a better term, but what I mean is there's multiple types of narration. Like in the very beginning, Moira receives a letter, and then it dives into the letter, which is very much written like a journal. And later on, she encounters some workers that are singing songs, and then it goes into detail on how those songs are written. And I find that really immerses me in a world, and just trying to unravel all these unique elements that you've put forth is a very enjoyable experience. I think you've done a great job stringing that together and bringing the reader along with you to learn about this strange place. It reads very modern, but then at the same time can feel very Roman and antiquated in the way that the world actually functions. Tell me more about just the world in general.
Well, so as you told me, you're kind of a third of the way through, so we're kind of going on a journey together in this interview. Uh, so really, the broader stroke of it is, and I don't want to ruin it for kind of the folks that are watching this and going to read the book later, but this is a post-apocalyptic world. So this is a recursive world. So we have the world has evolved, things have gone their course, and things maybe the world started over a couple times.
Okay.
And so there's a whole bunch of other elements that are going to be woven in around that as Moira and the group explore the cave, and they learn kind of some hidden truths that kind of justify why the empire that they're working with does some of the evil deeds it does, and why that cave is supposed to stay secret.
That's interesting. I hadn't detected that. That is gonna make me inform my reading going forward. What were some of your inspirations when you were going into? You decided you're gonna write prose. You want to make it a novel. Who were you reading that was informing your fiction work?
So probably in the last decade when I really started exploring this, I really thought, a lot of the fantasy that a lot of us are reading, it's some of it. I don't want to tear people down, but some of it's derivative. You pop open a fantasy book and they're like, and there's the elf, and we all just kind of have an image in our head. Oh, that's an elf. And I didn't quite want to be in that place where I wanted to assume the reader was assuming that we were kind of in this Tolkien-esque world. Not that I don't enjoy it. I mean, I've got a stack of Dragonlance books off to the side over there. Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman are, I owe them a lot of my life and a lot of the things that I enjoy. But on the other hand, I wanted to do something in a little bit different vein. I still wanted to have a high fantasy world, and that's what we're kind of building here. But I'm also, reading some Bradbury. I'm reading some Arthur C. Clarke, and you'll see when you talk about the different voices and different points of view, I'm kind of thinking about Arthur C. Clarke and kind of the very strange and sometimes surreal and very comical points of view he puts on things. And so I've been reading a lot of Howard, the original Conan tales, Bradbury stuff. So really going back to kind of these foundational folks in science fiction and fantasy writing, to really kind of get back to those basic and more foundational tropes that kind of have driven a lot of the other storytelling that we've seen in the last 100 years. In the hopes that I'm doing something that seems new, it seems like it's a slightly different take on things. I mean, obviously, we've all writers have kind of explored a lot of the old tropes. So I'm not going to be covering new ground trope-wise, but maybe just perspectives and ideas about how to explore those sort of things.
Absolutely. I always find that originality comes through more in the voice than in the ideas themselves. And I've encouraged fantasy writers since I started having a public platform to read widely, to not just read fantasy, to not just read what's popular in fantasy, but to read other genres, read nonfiction. Especially, I feel like nature writing is just such a huge component to fantasy. Because what are you doing in fantasy most of the time? You're questing, you're going off into the world. And I noticed that there is some really detailed description of the nature that your characters are finding themselves in. How much of that is real, and how much of them are kind of like made up plants, made up fauna? Because all of it, the way it's presented, I just believed them to be true.
So I'm glad you mentioned Lovecraft, because I think he offered a lot of sensory detail in some of his work. And you'll see some of that in some of the descriptions. I think about Mountains of Madness and kind of the impression that made on me, and kind of that long journey those guys are going through, and how some of it just seemed, the writing seemed insane. The passages they're going through are kind of as he's describing them, they're almost incomprehensible to the reader. And I'm like, oh, this must have just, it's just kind of surrealist. And I tried to add some of those elements in as the party is going into the cave, and you'll kind of see some of that where it's kind of hard to get through. But on the nature side, Clan of the Cave Bear. And I'm drawing a blank on the author, but Clan of the Cave Bear. If you're not familiar with it, is looking at the time when Homo sapiens are meeting Homo neanderthalis, and they're interacting, and they're trying to figure out a common language, and there's a lot of challenges there. But part of that book was just so detailed on their hunter-gatherer society and the plants they needed, and how they dealt with cleaning carcasses, and just all these little details about what would have been there in Ice Age Europe. And so I really took a lot of inspiration from, I'm going to make a fantasy environment, but I want it to be grounded in a reality. And I thought, well, not many people are writing a fantasy based in South America. And so most of the flora and fauna I'm kind of weaving in there is taken from many different ages of what would have been really found in South America.
Okay.
So it gives me a place to go, okay, well, I can create an entire environment without having to invent the entire environment. Because these are things that would have been in the different kind of, different biological areas throughout that area. So that gives me, the depth to go to the trees and not have to just make up a fantasy tree.
There's so much magic in our world, and when you only read fantasy and you only write fantasy, it's so easy to take that shortcut into, I'm just going to make something up. But if you just have a couple of resources, and use this book called Folk Medicine in the Mammoth Cave Area, which has a bunch of recipes, from that area, and it's super useful. It adds a lot of flair without much effort, and it's something that people actually were using at a point in history.
Yeah, well, I'm actually from Meigs County, Ohio originally, so Appalachian medicine and folklore is kind of the other part of kind of my influences. Because that whole strip through southern Ohio and in Kentucky and down to Mammoth Cave is like a biodiversity hotspot. I mean, there's more trees and more species of small shrubs and animals than in a lot of other places in the U.S.
It is absolutely fascinating. Have you ever gone down in the cave?
Yeah, I have. Just very briefly. We were kind of on a tight schedule, but yeah, amazing.
There's this part of Mammoth Cave on like the main historic tour, and there's this big giant boulder in the middle of a cavern, and they call it like the Giant's Tomb. And I thought that I was so inspired and awestruck looking at that. I had this idea for a short story, and I held on to it for 10 months after that vacation before I finally wrote it. And then as I was writing, even almost a year later, it just all came back. Like, if you haven't gone underground, people watching, you need to go underground because it will change your perspective of how our world works.